Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Child Psych Podcast. My name is Tammy.
And I'm Tania Johnson. We are registered psychologists, registered play therapists, co founders of the Institute of Child Psychology, and most importantly, mums. So, Tammy has three kids, and I have two. And what we're going to be talking about today is siblings and how to really nurture the relationships between siblings, the dynamics between siblings. This is an area of specialization for Tammy, so I'm going to hand it over to Tammy.
This comes up on social a lot is sibling rivalry. And so I guess this podcast is going to be two parts. We're going to talk about when, things don't go well with siblings, but also how to foster deep sibling relationships. And Tanya can speak about this from having two bio kids from the same set of parents. And I've had it where I have a blended family with two kids that are full siblings and then bringing in a kiddo with that. And now, so there's three of them. And this has been interesting to navigate as a parent. It was one thing to navigate it from a clinician's perspective, another entire thing to live it. So I speak from experience, and also when we teach our parenting courses, I bring up this stuff too, but I can actually say this stuff really works now that I have had to do this with a blended family and have deal with rivalry, and I've had to diffuse a lot of it. So I feel pretty good about that now. So
Reversed.
yeah, I think we're feeling good about today's podcast talking about this.
Good. So Tim, where do we start? I think for so many parents, all of us want our children to have good, connected relationships. But when we're actually in the trenches, things can feel very, very different.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we really have to understand that children are excellent observers, but really poor interpreters of what goes on in our household. And often we as parents have some interesting biases in how we treat our kids that we assume we don't because we love our kids the same, but we often don't treat them the same. And this comes from sometimes we have a go to kid, or we have a child we just connect with more easily. We have more in common with them. Or sometimes our kids remind us of us and we don't have a great relationship with ourselves. So our kids end up triggering us. And so, our relationship with our kids can be quite conflictual at times. And because of this, because our kids can trigger us, or we have an easier kid and then we have a more sensitive child and we have a more explosive child and we have our child that helps with chores the most, these kids are watching all this kind of play out and they don't quite understand why they're treated differently from their siblings. And it comes from a place where we're just trying to survive and we don't love one more than the other, but that's not how it's often received by our kids. So a lot of this is just about parenting on purpose, being very intentional about how we're treating our kids and understanding each child is so unique in the experiences they receive. This is why you can have 2, 3 kids from the same parents, parented I want to say, I'm giving air quotes here, the same way, because we actually don't parent our kids the same way, but they do grow up in the same house and they turn out so radically different. Part of it might be genetics, but another part of it is that they do get different experiences from their parents. And part of that is their perception of how they're treated by their parents. And like I said, they are really poor interpreters of what goes on.
Dr. Gabor-Mate speaks to that. He says that so often we'll say, but they were parented the same by the same parents. If they were parented by the same parents, he's like, it's impossible for kiddos that are born at different times be parented exactly the same because situations change. Stresses, even if we're not aware of them, stresses in homes change. Our financial situation changes. Our relationships between everybody else in the house changes. Political climates change. There's always shifts. So children will always hold different stresses, which then it kind of determines how they interact with one another and also with us.
Yeah, and I mean, there's been a lot of research on birth order, even. If nothing has really changed in your home necessarily, like maybe you had the same job and nothing has changed too much in political climate, whatever this is. At the end of the day, your resources as a parent have changed. Your emotional and cognitive resources have changed. So when you have just one child, or you have, for a long time, and then you have a second one that comes along, that firstborn we have a lot of hopes and aspirations, and we bring our best selves to the parenting table. We put a lot of effort and pressure on ourselves with our firstborn, probably much more, if we're being honest, than the next ones that come along. We've never done this before. We're just so cognizant about what they eat and when they sleep, and what we're doing wrong and what we're doing right. And we're reading all the parenting books, and we've got the baby books looking beautiful. And we spend lots of one-on-one time, and we buy all the toys and the apps and whatever it is we think we need as parents. And then our second one comes along, and we're in survival mode because now we've got a toddler and a screaming colicky baby, and we don't have time to make the beautiful baby book. We don't have time to worry about every single thing that they put in their mouth. And we've also learned that kids survive a lot better than they thought they would. Like, they survived their first cold, and they survived the first scraped knee and the bump on the head. And you're like, oh, okay, it's not as bad as I thought it was going to be when they got hurt. Like, we get over some of this stuff, but that child's experience of us being hyper vigilant or putting all this cascading effort into their care, when we move on to the second or third one, I think it progressively, as we get more kids, we put less maybe
100%
effort. I know you could probably speak to this. It's not we don't love them anymore, but it's just very different. We're a little bit more laid back about it. And so these kids experience us differently. It's a different version of us.
100%. There's absolutely no ways that people have the same parenting experience. It can't happen. It's impossible.
Yeah. And I mean, I was always, a joke in our family. If you had one easy kid, like, you're not getting that same experience the next time around. Like, that's just not what you're going to get. You're never going to get the same kid twice. So, Mother Nature will give you parenting 101 and give you an easy child. And they're really just preparing you for parenting 505, which is like maybe a really highly sensitive child or a highly explosive child or a child who's got neurally diverse. And so there's that piece too, is we don't always know what kind of kiddo we're going to get. And knowing this is kids fall into what's called birth order, where the first child, because we've put so much one-on-one time into them and we've been a little more hyper vigilant, we have really high expectations, those kids tend to, on average, it's statistics, right? There, of course, are outliers here, but they tend to be more responsible, higher achieving. They are more comfortable with adults, like talking with adults. They will help out more around the house. They'll help out with siblings. They generally are just older souls when it comes to compared to maybe their siblings. And then, we've relaxed a little bit as parents, and then the second one is born, and there tend to be, depending if you have more than two, if we just talk about if you have two, the second will do the polar opposite often than the first, because that's how they already see how their older sibling is valued, and they want to be seen to be their own unique individuals. So one might love dance and the next one will love academics. Like, they will go almost opposite, so they are visible to you and they get validation for being like their own person. And that, the second will be a little bit more laid back because you're more laid back in your parenting. They're a little more free spirited, so to speak. I don't know if you can, if this is like with your kids.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like the first one, Una, takes way more pride in kind of caring and nurturing, whereas Maya's still like, she really loves the baby roll. She's our last one. She loves the baby roll. Even this morning, she's in kindergarten and she's like, just brush my teeth for me. Like, I know you know how to brush your teeth, but she just loves that baby roll still. So they 100% fall into that.
Yeah. So there's this opposite role. And if you just have two, the second is more, and same goes if you have more than two, like if you have three. So it's either middle or the next born. They're actually more likely down the road to have stronger peer relationships. And that firstborn is more likely to stay more centered on the relationship with the parent. Granted, it's a healthy relationship. They've spent more one-on-one time with adults, right? So it's interesting to see that middle or that second will fall more to peer relationships. So that's just something to consider. Those friendships will be a little bit more important to them down the road. And if you are you lucky enough to have three, that's my household. One of the babies became middle. And this can happen, just so everyone knows. there is this stereotype about middle children feeling very like attention seeking, which is not necessarily what we want to call it. But with that, they can feel kind of invisible because the youngest is like the baby of the family. They're the last one, like they're the cute one, and parents are like, this is my baby. I'm done having kids now. And so our middle, they have the oldest, who's usually very high achieving, who is hyper responsible. Then you have the baby who's free spirited and everyone nurtures them and babies them and gives them all this love. And the middle child is like, hello, like, where do I fit into this? So they develop a little bit of idiosyncrasies around like this, like, I need to be seen, I need to be heard. And they'll find quite unique ways, but they can develop a little bit of a chip on their shoulder about this. And my husband's a middle child, so he has talked to me about this, like what that was like for him. And it's very similar to our middles. Like we can kind of see it playing out, and we have to be so cognizant that she does feel invisible sometimes because of this, because of the older high, is doing all her jobs. It doesn't have to be told. And then there's the baby, and it can create rivalry that way.
You can see why. I'm a middle child too, and I can completely relate to that. I had to find very unique ways to be seen. And now as an adult, it is very much part of my personality, whether it's doing a podcast or writing a book, or it's about, hello, I'm over here.
I exist. Yeah, and I'm a stereotypical oldest, like very much just about like high achieving, and I'll take care of everything and you'll never have to ask me twice. Like I will just go do everything. But a little harder for me to just like let go. Like it's just, I'm just like, no, I must be responsible and I have to do this. Like there's that piece, right? And so every child has these really unique, and there's nothing wrong with any of those. It's just different. And just, we want you to understand maybe where that comes from. So I have like a few like tips of, we'll first talk about like what to be aware of how we can sometimes inadvertently create rivalry with our kids. And which then leads to, he hit me and he did this and it's not fair. And they're okay. Been there, done that. It still happens. Less now that we've navigated this over the years. We've kind of learned to deal with this. And then we'll talk about like what to do when they fight. When it all goes wrong, and they will. They're pulling hair, or they're screaming, or so and so hurt my feelings, or it's going to happen. So we're not saying you can completely avoid this. But okay. So how does your child read your interactions that you have with their siblings? So I think you have to ask, like, are we valuing each child for their unique gifts and attributes? Because every child is going to have, like, maybe one is good at sports and one is really good at reading and one is really good at art, if that makes sense. Like they all have these really unique gifts. So do we take the time to acknowledge that each one has gifts? Because honestly, if you grew up in a home where it was a really big focus on sports or academics, and you've got a kiddo who doesn't want to play a sport to play, to save her life, or it's just like not a great reader, kids will pick up on that sometimes, because you'll make a bigger fuss when one child gets an academic accolade or one first place at, a sporting event, because we'll have these biases because our parents probably put a lot of merit on us doing well in certain activities. So we put pressure then on our kids to do well, and we end up, it looks like we're only acknowledging one of those child's gifts or contributions.
And I think too, as we acknowledge their contributions to the world, we're never going to balance it perfectly. But something that comes up in my house is, so with the baby of the family, when she puts her plate away without us asking her to, will be, Maya, good job, you put your plate away, mom didn't have to ask you today. And then the older sibling will say, I do that every time and you never say anything. So I think as we acknowledge their contributions, really making sure that we're seeing both of them for where they are developmentally and noticing their process with them.
Yeah, and being able to say sometimes to your oldest, because sometimes we can have those conversations with the oldest, is being like, your sister has a really hard time with this. So sometimes I will say those things because I really want to encourage her. But yeah, you're right. You do help out with that. And it feels like in that moment, you felt kind of invisible. So I would probably like pull my child aside when they said that, right? Like I'd be like, oh, I can see that was kind of like that's a hard one.
And I think something else with siblings is that you're raising a group of children with different prefrontal cortex development. So you're working with these different brains, which sometimes we celebrate their brains at different stages, but it makes it difficult for them to always understand what's going on here. But really, we have a group of differently growing prefrontal cortexes in our house, which is tough.
Yeah, they're at these different developmental ages and they need to be spoken to differently. And some of them can't understand the ambiguity of what's going on. So yeah, it can be very tricky. And one of the things that I found myself doing sometimes, and I've been much better at it now, especially around meals, this was hard for me, is comparing, being like, why can't you be a better eater like your sister? Or why can't you help out like your older sister does? Or, why does it, and I know that's probably I would say that when I'm really like triggered, I probably wouldn't make a habit of saying that, but we sometimes can overtly make these comparisons or it's inadvertent. So, you know, um, we might also say things like, just to warn you, my son can be quite bossy. Like we'll say things, it's not like his sister. Like we'll make these comparisons to other people when our child's within like earshot, right? It's so different with this child, and we'll say these things in front of other people. So I think making sure we're not we're not saying those things, and also being aware of our biases, because we can compare by just simply putting more merit on one thing that
Mhm.
I think a child's good at.
I love that. And our words really become the narrative of who they are. They go into their soul and they start going, I am lazy, or I am not helpful, or I am someone who always spills everything. So we really want to watch that our words don't become their narrative, their life narrative.
Yes. And so, I mean, we can celebrate successes separately, or making sure, like when we have a dinner, we acknowledge like what they've all maybe done really well that week, or they're something they're working on that month. So, what can be really helpful is setting a family meeting and saying what each child is working towards. So it is overtly stated that, one child's working on reading, one child is working on, doing well at her dance recitals, and another one is working on being able to finish this art project they've been working on for 4 months. So that way, when we come back to it, say, remember, that was so and so's goal. It was their goal to do this. So we're acknowledging how hard they're working there, because the whole family knows it's something they're working towards.
Love that.
Another thing I love is so kids want our attention, right? And there's only one or two parents typically in the house. There's not usually more than that. And if you've got more than one child, there's only so much of you to go around. So we ideally want to obviously spend one-on-one time with each child, but sometimes that's not always possible. So a shortcut around that is to catch them getting along. Now, often kids we will only acknowledge our kids when they were fighting or when they're doing something they're not supposed to be doing. And the essence of that is, do more of this, and then mom and dad will connect with you, even if it's like negative. They want to be seen. And so they will divert to fighting if that is the only way they can connect with you. That is the only time they get acknowledgement from you. And so a lot of times I tend to, unless kids are being really, we have a zero unkindness policy in our house. So like obviously I intervene if people are swearing or putting each other down or hitting one another. But I'll ignore sometimes some squabbles and let them work, as long as they're not hurting each other, ignore what I don't want, and really put merit on what I do want to see, and just saying, oh, I really noticed you guys sharing the Lego today, or I noticed how kind you were when your brother fell down and you helped him stand up. So really focusing on the values that you want to see with your kids. And I always say like 5 of those for every one conflict they have. 5 to 1 is like what you're aiming for here.
Beautiful. I love that. And just what you'd mentioned earlier too about watching what kids overhear us talking about, same thing. So when they do really well, to make sure that your kids also overhear you saying to somebody else, hey, it was amazing to see what Aiden did with his sister today. So they can hear those words too coming not just at them, but also about them.
Yeah, and that's where I really want to focus on gratitude for their siblings. So when I catch my kids being kind and altruistic to each other, I will point it out at the dinner table usually. I mean, if I can catch them in the moment, but sometimes I actually put it in the notes section of my phone. And during dinner time or breakfast or whenever we have time together, sometimes it's in the car, like when we're all together, I'll say, I really noticed your older sister did this for you. You're really lucky to have her. Or she stood up for you today at school. I heard the teacher let me know that. And so it's really reinforcing this gratitude for how well they treat each other, or something that that sibling did. And you could take it like a step further. If you're one of those parents who likes to get really creative, you could do a gratitude jar where kids will, they, when they feel gratitude for their siblings, they write it down, you put it in a jar, and on Friday nights or once a month or whenever you want to do it, you can read those things out loud. I used to do that as a teacher for kids in my class, was a gratitude jar, and catching each other being good, like,
Oh, I
essentially.
love it. I love it.
Mm,
I love it. Love it. Because really, that's all about values right there, isn't it? So kindness, gratitude, connection.
yeah. And then I think too, where sometimes we we're not really watching what's going on, and sometimes kids have to share rooms, is being, and I have a very big rule about this in my house, that things are going to explode sometimes and kids have a hard time and they need their own space. And so I don't care if you have to take duct tape and put a line across the room where they each have their own side of the bedroom. When they have had too much, they need a place to go where the other siblings can't bother them.
Mm-hmm.
And in our room, my kids all have their own rooms. They are not allowed in their other siblings' rooms without explicit permission.
Mm.
They are not allowed in. Now that's a little harder when you have like a 1-year old. Like, you have to like monitor that and, work on that. They won't be able to do that. But as they get older, it's like their room is sacred to them and they need to be able to go there to cool down, like to kind of collect themselves, or if they're upset, they need to know they can go in there and no one's going to bother them.
I love that. I absolutely love that. Everybody needs a safe space without feeling as if there is no room. I think everybody needs that.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too is, do the siblings have, like, we talk about special time where parents spend one-on-one time, they make a conservative effort that kids get one-on-one time so they're not competing for attention. That's important. But is there a time the siblings are having special time together, like the three of them or the two of them, where it is sacred time, where you're not asking them to do chores, you're not asking them to clean up, where they can play Lego, they can play a game, go for a walk, go for a bike ride, and you're saying that is their time as siblings to spend together.
I
And
love it.
yeah, and they can take turns choosing if that's what it is. But the idea is saying, like, this is a time where, we connect as a family. And then you can do, of course, family nights. But I actually like doing it where the siblings all, in my house, they play board games together. And no
Yeah.
one's allowed on their phones, no one's allowed on their devices. And yes, of course, like, conflict arises, but it's important that they have that time, that sacred time, as a unit as well, the
Mm.
siblings.
And what I'm hearing there, Tammy, is just being, again, very intentional about that, because that sacred time will happen often when I say to the girls when they're bored, when I'm not going to fill space for them. And I know that this is also the time when sibling arguments are most likely to erupt. But there are times in our house where I'm saying, they'll come to me and they'll say, Mom, I'm bored. And I'll say, I know you can figure this out. And then within time, usually 15, 20 minutes, they're playing a game. The other day it was a lizard. They made a whole lizard bed and a lizard house and all of the rest out of a whole lot of boxes. That time is just their time. But had I filled it, they would never have that connection time together.
Absolutely. The last one I want to talk about before we go into what happens when it all goes south, because it does, is getting our kids together, getting in on the nighttime routine together. So, of course, we have ideally, like, we have like this beautiful nighttime routine that we're told we're supposed to have with our kids. But if you have more than 2 kids, especially like in my house, we don't have 40 minutes to spend with each child. It's just
Yeah.
not going to happen. So, what we've started doing is getting them involved in each other's bedtime routine. So, the kids brushing their teeth at the same time, and then we'll all read stories together in the living room together, where they get to choose how they say goodnight to their sibling. It can be a high five, a hug, a handshake, or like a verbal goodnight, but it's acknowledging everybody in the household when they go to bed.
Mm.
You could cuddle with as a family and like watch a show if it's like on a Friday night. Like, it's idea that we all get involved before we go into sleep, that the kids, it's a family affair. Like, it's not just that one-on-one time, and it saves us time as parents, like when all the kids kind of can do parts of this nighttime ritual together.
Yeah, that's beautiful. We do all of our nighttime ritual together. There's just no way we could do it separately. One of the things that I heard, and I know this is going to lean us into the next section that you're going to talk about, Dr. Laura Markham with the bedtime routine, is she said get them to work together instead of against each other. So often we'll say, race your sister upstairs to go brush your teeth. And then we wonder why they fight, but we constantly put them in a competitive mode against one another. So she says, instead, you always put them on a team and you put yourself on a team, because they need to be teammates, not don't put them against one another.
And that competitive piece, like we're trying to make it fun. And I get that, like you're trying to make it, and that does, like racing my kids to bed is actually really effective, but not if it's racing each other. Like it has to be us or them versus, like the kids versus the parents. You can do this fun thing with like having, on the trampoline with your kids, and you're doing like, or where they're trying to double bounce you like as a group, or they're having a pillow fight and it's parents versus the kids. Like what Tania's saying is getting them on a team and then you, like it's,
and that's a message Bernard and I have always given the girls is you guys are on a team and we are on a team. Because I want them to be each other's teammate for life, hopefully.
Yeah. Okay, so let's say it all goes south. And Tan, it'll be interesting to see how you kind of deal with this in your house. So what I want all of you to take from this is don't fall into the role of the judge, the juror, and the executioner with siblings. Don't, because you will never get the full story of what happened. You don't know how they were poking at each other or what hurt happened 6 hours before and the other one's getting back at them, or they stick their tongue out at the other one, or we just don't know what has happened. And the second we make one the aggressor and one the victim, they start to fall into those roles really quickly. And it's exhausting and they feel unseen and unheard. So as much as we can, I really try to have a zero blame policy, because conflict, I always tell my kids, conflict is always two people engaged in something. It's not one person against the other in our household. Like I really try. And so again, otherwise they keep perpetuating these roles of like, you're the bad one and you're the good one, and they're aggressive and they're a victim. Like we do end up with these labels if we keep falling into that role of like, you should know better and you always do this and why don't you leave your sister alone. And so that was something that was happening a lot when I entered a blended family with two of the kids, is I saw one was always the victim and one was always the aggressor. And then I would watch them being objective because I wasn't their mom, and I was like, oh, like the little one is getting in here. Like you're not seeing it. Yes, she's tiny, but there is definitely, it goes both ways here. Or it's just like, it's a little sneaky sometimes, right? So, because the youngest gets away with a little more. So I think we can disregard some squabbles and we want kids to work it out on their own. Essentially, yeah, there's sometimes I'm like, what do you want to tell your brother? Like, go tell him that. Oh, he hit me. He won't share. Okay, use your word. I want you to take your words. What do you want to say to him? And then I'll have them practice with me and then go tell their sibling that. Like I will do that a lot of coaching. But then sometimes like things fall apart and someone hurts someone and someone hits someone and like, oh crap, like I got to intervene here.
Yeah.
And I think at that point, when it falls apart, I think first thing I'm doing is making sure both kids get acknowledged here. Now, of course, you go to the one that's bleeding. Like we want to make sure like the one that's physically hurt, but we're not instantly yelling at the other one because we don't actually know the whole story of what's gone on. And I think if I can separate them and, if one parent goes to one and one parent goes to the other and then we switch, the important thing is we separate because we know like our kids' thinking brains are offline. So we have to separate them. And we're acknowledging both kids because they're both hurt. They're both hurting at this point in time. And so for me is hearing both sides, knowing I'm not taking a side, but hearing both sides. And, maybe this is a point where they both need to separate and go to the rooms, but they're not in trouble for that. I'm just saying, mom needs 5 minutes to help your brother, get him a Band-Aid, and I'm going to come talk to you. And this also, when I separate them and I do this, it gives me time to cool down. So I'm not screaming at them being like, you should know better. And we don't hit in our house. And we can get like really, like this is not helping. This is adding gasoline to the fire at this point in time. And so once we hear the story and we have, validated, their emotion, because the emotion's always okay. It's that maybe not the behavior, but the emotion is okay. And we've done some co-regulation to like bring them down. It's like, tell me what happened, so let's imagine you've got one child who was the I want to put in quotes here, the aggressor, like the one who actually we saw instigate maybe something physical. For that child, I might say, it sounds like you were really, really frustrated with your brother. So you ended up knocking over the Lego tower. is there, what happened there? Help me understand what happened. And then they'll tell you, oh, well, I worked really hard on that. And then he hit it over. So I hit him. And I said, okay, I wonder did you see your brother crying? Did you notice his tears? Yeah. Can you tell me about a time that someone hit you or hurt your feelings and you were crying? What was that like for you? So I've acknowledged their feelings. They were so frustrated and it feels really unfair. But then I want to point the attention to how the other person was impacted. What was that like? And what's a time they felt like that? And say, okay, so sometimes, we have hits in us. And, my kids already know how we talk about like flipping the lid of the brain. Yeah. So they understand like their amygdala hijacks their brain and the thinking brain goes offline and we don't always make the best choices. So my kids know that whole song and dance. And say, okay, but sometimes we need a do-over. So I wonder what can happen. Now, granted, my child is now calm at this point. Like they're not still screaming. Like they've calmed down. Then we're going to say, well, I wonder what you could do differently next time your brother does this. And so at that point, I'm going to have actually my child practice with me. Okay. I'm going to practice like what they could do next time. And then I'll also say, now you're right. Like it was so hard. Your brother knocked over your tower and you were so angry. But, it sounds like, and I'm going to talk to him about that and we're going to, work that out. But it sounds like maybe you see that hitting your brother wasn't the best idea. Like you can see that. So he's really hurting right now. How are you going to make this right? Because, in our family, we make mistakes. We make it right. So what do you think if that was you, what would need to happen? So again, this process is long. This is not something that happens overnight. And then this is how we get apologies, is we want this to be authentic. Kids pick up on false apologies. It doesn't actually bode well if we look at the research and how it's received. It's better than no apology, according to the research. But at that point, we want to teach our kids how to then, if it's apology they come up with, sometimes my kids won't apologize. They write a note. Or they'll make them a gift. It's like a peace offering. So sometimes it's not an apology, but if we want to coach them on apologies, we can do this. We want to teach them statements using I messages, like I feel. So I felt really frustrated when you knocked over my Lego tower. I wish you wouldn't do that. So we're teaching them how to, what needs to happen, I messages, but I shouldn't have hit you. I'm sorry. So we're saying how this person's actions impacted us. We're taking ownership that we shouldn't have done that. And then the last part's really important is what are they going to do different next time? So the next time I'm going to go upstairs and go to my room, or I'll just tell you with my words or whatever it is they're going to do to do differently next time. And then the very final piece is our child who's receiving that apology from that child does not say it's okay. It's okay. Refrain from telling your child it's okay because it wasn't okay. Violence isn't okay. Mean words aren't okay. We teach the child receiving the apology to say, I accept your apology, or thank you for the apology. Okay. And then we're doing this whole coaching thing with the other child too. Like it is exhausting to do this, but I promise you in the long run, this pays off. Like we're teaching conflict resolution. We're teaching children to use I messages. We're teaching them how to give an authentic apology. And both children are getting a chance to do this because we're doing the same coaching with both kids because there's always two sides.
Yeah. I think for so many of us, we were brought up in a generation where it's now very instinctive to say sorry to your brother. But really, there's nothing actually happening in that apology. There's, as you said, there's nothing authentic. And that's more about our own sense of control than actually fixing what happened.
Yeah. And we conflict is normal. Like you're never going to have siblings that get along 100% of the time. And the more we're cognizant and the more we are intentional about cultivating really positive relationships, we're not going to see the same level of rivalry and conflict, but it's still going to happen. Just like your marriage is never going to be perfect. You're always going to have fights. And we want kids to learn to work this out with their siblings, not kids at school, because we have some element of control in facilitating healthy repairs when it's our kids. So we have this opportunity to teach them within the family system where they're safe to do this correctly, or to at least do it in a healthy way. that so when they go out into the real world, they'll know how to do this with their partner in the future, with friendships in the future. But if it's always happening in the context of the school relationship, we have absolutely zero control with how that dynamic is going to play out.
And I think too, as we talk about healthy arguments, I think within reason, healthy arguments with a partner, if you have a partner within the household, healthy arguments and healthy repairs are also really important, because our kids are watching and they're learning. And every time they do it with their sibling and they learn, and every time they see us do it with somebody else and they learn, we create this stronger neural pathway for them being able to be in conflict and in connection with somebody at the same time.
That's such a good point. When kids are treating each other poorly, you may say, well, maybe that's being modeled at school. But when I work with families, a lot of times those kids are watching how you speak about other people, how you and your spouse, fight. Like, this doesn't always come out of nowhere. Like, it's not always the case, but again, kids are always watching, and they're at this point, they are excellent observers, but poor interpreters. They don't understand we're stressed about work. They don't understand that they didn't see all these, microaggressions that had happened earlier. All they say is, oh, this is what I do with anger, or this is what I do when things feel unfair. And this is what I do with an apology. Like, they're watching. So the question is, like, what are they seeing you do?
100%. You mentioned kindness earlier on, and when my girls are in conflict, kindness is, we've got 3 family values, but kindness is probably our top value. And I will say to them, I love that little phrase, in our family. So I always say, in our family, kindness is very important. What do you think Maya's heart needs right now? And then we move forward in that way.
That's beautiful. Yeah, because we get in the habit of saying, like, you did this, or you shouldn't do this. And it makes people quite defensive, honestly. Like, when you say you shouldn't and you always, and this doesn't bode well with our marital relationships either. Makes people, that criticism makes people very defensive and shut down. But if you're reminding them of a value that exists within, like, the family, it's not a criticism of them per se. It's just a reminder of, like, this is how we all are held accountable for our actions in this family. Not just like one person. It's like, no, and we can talk about times where we messed up too, and we didn't hold that value very well. But again, bring it back to, like, how are we going to make that right? Or how do we make a repair? Or how do we, whatever that is, like you had phrased it.
Yeah. And I think too, letting our kids know, like you said, that we are also messy, imperfect human beings. So in our family, Una said to me the other day, she was like, Mom, you're working on your serious eyes when there's a problem at home, and I'm working on my loud voice when there's a problem at home. We're all working on something.
Yeah. Oh, that was, and I think that feels good. Like, because I don't know about you, but growing up, often it was like, do as I say, not as I do. Like, our parents were swearing and screaming and doing all these things, but we weren't allowed to do those things. And they didn't always own up to it. And so, we have an opportunity with our own kids to be like, I'm going to do that differently. That doesn't mean your parents were bad. It's just probably how they were raised. But then we have things like this podcast and books now that say, oh, there might be another way to do this with our kids that doesn't have to create those intergenerational cycles.
Totally. And when we know better, we do better.
Absolutely. Well, everyone, if this really speaks to you, we have a lovely pre-recorded workshop by Dr. Laura Markham. She has a book called Peaceful Parent, Happy Siblings. And we were so fortunate that Dr. Laura presented at our conference on this topic, I think about 2 years ago. And so if you go to the link in our bio, or you can purchase her book, it's amazing. We'll include a link to that as well. She has a beautiful way to take kind of what we talked about in this podcast and really expand on it and give wonderful examples. And we're just so lucky that Dr. Laura has worked with us for all of these years. So if that is something you're interested, you can take 30% off. You'll see that the code and the link in the bio, and you'll hopefully feel more competent in navigating those sibling dynamics as a result.
Quickly say something about Dr. Markham. She has this wonderful way of engaging and talking about how children are actually she has this wonderful way of presenting where you feel completely engaged in the way that she presents, because she acts out the kids' voices. She does the conflict for you. She's probably one of my favorite presenters.
Yeah, she's got a great blog called Aha Parenting. Like, look at her blog. It is phenomenal. We love Laura, as you can tell.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us.
Okay, thank you, everyone. And here's cheers to you and best of luck with managing all the craziness that comes with siblings, but all the joy that comes as well.
Thank you, Tammy.